Hey, welcome back! Today we're talking about the Scarlet Letter, and this is the conclusion of the book. And there's a lot to unpack in the conclusion and the resolution for these characters. When we last left off, Hester and Dimmesdale were planning on running away together, and it was actually the day that they were planning to run away. It was election day. Dimmesdale was going to preach his election day sermon, and then they were going to get on a boat and flee. But just at the end of chapter 21, Hester hears that Chillingworth is planning on going with them. They're not going to be able to escape him. He's getting on the boat too. You can't escape from the devil. And so, in chapter 22, we have Hester in the middle of the crowd, in the middle of this moment, and she is afraid, and she needs to tell Dimmesdale something, but there's no way she can approach him and talk to him. What is she gonna do? And in this moment, actually, Mr. Dimmesdale goes into the church to begin his sermon. And in fact, the huge procession is now going by with all the magistrates and all the leaders of the town in their finery, and they're going forward, and here comes Mr. Dimmesdale. And man, does he look good! He's been looking really sickly lately, but boy, he looks good now. It was the observation of those who beheld him now that never since Mr. Dimmesdale first set his foot on the New England shore had he exhibited such energy as was seen in the gait and air with which he kept his pace in the procession. There was no feebleness of step, as at other times. His frame was not bent, nor did his hand rest ominously upon his heart. And although he has this energy, there's also sort of this distance in his eyes. He looks like he's thinking of something else. Hester Prynne, gazing steadfastly at the clergyman, felt a dreary influence come over her, but wherefore or whence she knew not, unless that he seemed so remote from her own sphere, and utterly beyond her reach. One glance of recognition, she had imagined, must needs pass between them. But as he goes by, he seems almost unrecognizable. He's a different man. And she feels the distance between him and her. And it's a distance that's going to continue to be explored throughout this whole chapter. So much so that even Pearl says, "Mother, was that the same minister that kissed me by the brook? I could not be sure that it was he, so strange he looked," continued the child. "Else I would have run to him and bid him kiss me now before all the people, even as he did yonder among the dark old trees. What would the minister have said, mother? Would he have clapped his hand over his heart and scowled at me and bid me be gone?" She really wants him to confess and claim her in front of everybody. Mistress Hibbins then happens up and also comments on how different Dimmesdale looks. "Is that the same man who was running around in the forest just the other day? Couldst thou surely tell, Hester, whether he was the same man that encountered thee on the forest path?" And though Hester tries to say, "I don't know anything about it," Mistress Hibbins says, "Oh, I know all about that. I know all the doings of the black man. And he's got a secret, that Dimmesdale, why he always keeps his hand over his heart." And of course, this perks up Pearl's interest because she wants to know the secret of why he always keeps his hand over his heart as well. Mistress Hibbins actually shows deference to Pearl because she says, "Hey, you might be that little demon child, aren't ya?" And so Dimmesdale goes into the church and begins his sermon. And Hester is outside listening. And she can't hear the actual words, but she can hear Dimmesdale's voice, the rising and falling of his voice, and the power that it conveys. And she feels frozen here, right by the scaffold. Pearl, meanwhile, has actually run off and is flitting all around the marketplace, and she runs again into the sailors. The shipmaster tries to give her a kiss, but she refuses, and so he tosses her the gold chain from his hat, and she winds it into her outfit because she's so talented at weaving everything in her environment into her clothing. And he gives her the message not to worry about Dimmesdale, because Chillingworth is going to bring Dimmesdale aboard, so Hester can come by herself with Pearl. And so Pearl carries the message back. And here Hester hears again how very separated she's going to be from Dimmesdale forever. And in this moment, suddenly the crowd around her begins to stare at her again. She's been wearing the Scarlet Letter for 7 years, and most people have gotten used to it. But there's a whole lot of new people in town, and they begin pointing their fingers at her and wondering who she is and what she represents. And so that, of course, reawakens the feelings of the locals who begin telling the story, and everyone is staring at her and looking at her. Meanwhile, within the church, everyone is staring at Dimmesdale with awe and wonder. What a perfect, wonderful man. Well, outside, Hester is again that image of infamy. And they're in two entirely separate spheres, completely apart from each other. Chapter 23. Dimmesdale finishes his sermon, and everyone is so awed by it. It's the best sermon they've ever heard. And everyone pours out of the church all talking about how this was the best day ever. That was the best sermon ever. We're so charged, we're so excited, and everybody's pumped. Everything is so wonderful. And at this moment, Dimmesdale begins to walk from the church. And as everyone looks back at their wonderful minister who is just preaching so powerfully, they see how weak he is. How feeble and pale he looked amid all his triumph. The energy or say rather the inspiration which had held him up until he should have delivered the sacred message that brought its own strength along with it from heaven, was withdrawn, now that it has so faithfully performed its office. The glow, which they had just beheld burning on his cheek, was extinguished. Like a flame that sinks down hopelessly among the late decaying embers, it seemed hardly the face of a man alive, with such a death-like hue. It was hardly a man with life in him that tottered on this path so nervelessly, yet tottered and did not fall. Looking back, Reverend Wilson, Governor Billingham, see him and see that he seems to be in a kind of trouble. And then all of a sudden he pauses and he looks up at Hester and Pearl. There stood Hester, holding little Pearl by the hand, and there was the scarlet letter on her breast. The minister here made pause, although the music still played the stately and rejoicing march to which the procession moved. It summoned him onward, onward to the festival. But here he made a pause. And as he pauses, everyone begins to stare at him, thinking that something is going to happen. He's going to maybe just sort of be lifted up into heaven because of how wonderful and holy he is. Then, in that moment, he turns to the scaffold and stretches out his arms. "Hester," said he, "come hither. Come, my little Pearl." It was a ghastly look with which he regarded them, but there was something at once tender and strangely triumphant in it. The child, with a bird-like motion which was one of her characteristics, flew to him and clasped him about his knees. Hester Prynne, slowly, as if impelled by inevitable fate and against her strongest will, likewise drew near, but paused before she reached him. At this instant old Roger Chillingworth thrust himself through the crowd, or perhaps so dark, disturbed, and evil was his look, he rose up out of some nether region to snatch back his victim from what he sought to do. Be that as it might, the old man rushed forward and caught the minister by the arm. "Madman, hold! What is your purpose?" whispered he. "Wave back that woman! Cast off this child! All shall be well! Do not blacken your fame and perish in dishonor! I can yet save you! Would you bring infamy on your sacred profession?" "Ha, tempter! Methinks thou art too late," answered the minister, encountering his eye, fearfully but firmly. "Thy power is not what it was. With God's help I shall escape thee now." And so he takes Hester's hand and Pearl's hand, and he finally walks up the scaffold. Now he can barely walk, he's so weak and fragile, but he steps up there with them, gaining strength from holding their hands, and stands on the scaffold. And Chillingworth goes up with them, because he's part of all of this. And everybody's all upset, and they don't know what's going on, but something's happening here. As they get up there, Chillingworth says to Dimmesdale, "Hadst thou sought the whole earth over, there was no one place so secret, no high place, nor lowly place where thou couldst have escaped me, save on this very scaffold." "Thanks be to him who hath led me hither," answered the minister. And so he finds a way out from Chillingworth's clutches, and that is through confession. It's the only way to escape from the devils, to rip open and expose that wound. "Is not this better," murmured he to Hester, "than what we dreamed of in the forest?" And he turns to all the people, and the sun is shining down on him. "People of New England," cried he, with a voice that rose over them, high, solemn, and majestic, yet always a tremor through it, and sometimes a shriek, struggling up out of the fathomless depth of remorse and woe. "Ye that have loved me, ye that have deemed me holy, behold me here, the one sinner of the world. At last I stand upon a spot where 7 years since I should have stood. Here, with this woman, whose arm, more than the little strength wherewith I have crept hitherward, sustains me, at this dreadful moment, from grovelling down upon my face. Lo, the scarlet letter which Hester wears. Ye have all shuddered at it. Wherever her walk hath been, wherever so miserably burdened she might have hoped to find repose, it hath cast a lurid gleam of awe and horrible repugnance round about her. But there stood one in the midst of you, whose brand of sin and infamy ye have not shuddered." It seemed at this point as if the minister must leave the remainder of his secret undisclosed, but he fought back the bodily weakness, and still more the faintness of heart, that was striving for the mastery with him. He threw off all assistance, and stepped passionately forward a pace before the woman and the child. "It was on him," he continued, with a kind of fierceness. So determined was he to speak out the whole. "God's eye beheld it. The angels were forever pointing at it. The devil knew it well, and fretted it continually with the touch of his burning finger. But he hid it cunningly from men, and walked among you with the mien of a spirit mournful because so pure in a sinful world, and sad because he missed his heavenly kindred. Now, at the death hour, he stands up before you. He bids you look again at Hester's scarlet letter. He tells you that with all its mysterious horror, it is but the shadow of what he bears on his own breast, and that even this, its own red stigma, is no more than the type of what has seared his inmost heart. Stand any here that question God's judgment on a sinner. Behold, behold, dreadful witness of it. With a convulsive motion, he tore away his ministerial band from his breast. It was revealed. He tears open his shirt, and there is a scarlet letter on his chest. How to get there? I don't know. And he sinks down on the scaffold, dying. Thou hast escaped me, Chillingworth repeated more than once. Thou hast escaped me. May God forgive thee, said the minister. Thou too hast deeply sinned. He withdrew his dying eyes from the old man and fixed them on the woman and the child. My little Pearl, said he feebly, and there was a sweet and gentle smile over his face, as of a spirit sinking into deep repose. Nay, now that the burden was removed, it seemed almost as if he would be sportive with the child. Dear little Pearl, wilt thou kiss me now? Thou wouldst not yonder in the forest, but now thou wilt. Pearl kissed his lips. A spell was broken. The great scene of grief in which the wild infant bore a part had developed all her sympathies, and as her tears fell upon her father's cheek, they were a pledge that she would grow up amid human joy and sorrow, nor forever do battle with the world, but be a woman in it. Towards her mother, too, Pearl's errand as a messenger of anguish was all fulfilled. Pearl has her moment of transformation, the one that we've been hoping for. She finds a grief that humanizes her. She finally gains a father, even as she loses him. But it gives her a human connection that allows her to transform into a woman. And of course, this is the third kiss, and the one that actually changes Pearl. We had the one at the governor's house, we had the one in the woods, and now we have this one. Well worth comparing the tone of all three of those. Hester, said the clergyman, farewell. Shall we not meet again, whispered she, bending her face down close to his. Shall we not spend our immortal life together? Surely, surely we have ransomed one another with all this woe. Thou lookest far into eternity with those bright dying eyes, then tell me what thou seest. Hush, Hester, hush, he said with tremulous solemnity. The law we broke, the sin here so awfully revealed, let these alone be in thy thoughts. I fear, it may be that when we forgot our God, when we violated our reverence each for the other's soul, it was thenceforth vain to hope that we could meet hereafter in an everlasting and pure reunion. God knows, and he is merciful. So he sees what they did in the past as a violation of each other's souls. Notice the difference in the way he spoke about it in the woods. He didn't see it as a violation of a soul back in the woods. It was something about passion and love. It felt good, so it must have been good. Here he's seeing instead the pain and consequence that he's brought on Hester's soul, as well as his own. But although he's not sure whether they'll ever be able to be together in the afterlife, he has some hope. Listen to what he says next. God knows, and he is merciful. And then he goes on to prove God's mercy in a way that's really interesting, and I want to talk about. He hath proved his mercy most of all in my afflictions, by giving me this burning torture to bear upon my breast, by sending yonder dark and terrible old man to keep the torture always at red heat, by bringing me hither to die this death of triumphant ignominy before the people. Had either of these agonies been wanting, I had been lost forever. Praise be his name, his will be done, farewell. And then he falls over and dies. Notice where he finds the mercy of God. He finds the mercy of God in the torture that he's had over the past 7 years. The intense pain, the horror, having Chillingworth constantly picking at him, and finally being given the opportunity to die. That doesn't sound that great, but he sees that as a mercy because it finally showed him the way out. He finally found his escape in this, even if it was incredibly, horribly painful the whole time. Now, quick note about the romantic ending of this book. Dimmesdale gets to confess and die, which is such a romantic thing, having that one huge triumphant moment and then going out. Quit while you're ahead. Dimmesdale never has to carry the shame forward. He doesn't have to live with the shame anymore, which is mildly frustrating to me. Especially since Hester's had to deal with it this whole time. What if their roles had been reversed? How would Dimmesdale have dealt with being publicly shamed from the beginning? And yet, it's definitely a romantic triumph. He finds his freedom and he's set free in this moment. And Romanticism doesn't want to deal with any more consequences than that. But there are other characters to unpack in chapter 24. We still have to find out what happens to Hester, and to Pearl, and to Chillingworth, and to the populace. Because the people, the crowd, the community, who have been constantly looking at them through this entire book, gazing at them and having impressions of them, their impressions are still an important part of the story, and we still have to unpack a little bit more how they take this revelation of the Scarlet Letter. And the answer is, in a lot of different ways. Some of them are moved by this and feel that although Dimmesdale did something really wrong, they forgive him in some ways because of the great passion with which he confesses at the end. Other people say that maybe the Scarlet Letter on his chest was actually just some huge sermon lesson that he was giving at the end. He really didn't do anything wrong, he just wanted to show us all what sin's all about as he dies. Great object lesson, Dimmesdale, I got that sermon. And there are even people who say they didn't see anything on his chest. No, Dimmesdale was pure all along. I don't know what you're talking about. Going to show that the public opinion, the public eye, never really sees very clearly, and continually sees what it wants to see. Chillingworth's end is also very interesting, because after Dimmesdale is gone, and after his plot against Dimmesdale failed, Chillingworth has nothing else to live for, and he sort of crumples away. All the passion that he poured into his revenge leaves a gap that he just dries up from. But with his devilish office done, now he also has one more chance to show his humanity. Hawthorne offers him a little bit of mercy, saying that that passionate hatred was, in some ways, just the flip side of passionate love. And maybe Roger Chillingworth deserves some forgiveness as well. But he also points out one key detail about Chillingworth after Chillingworth's death. When Chillingworth dies, he bequeaths a very considerable amount of property, both here and in England, to little Pearl. So Pearl gains an inheritance from a father that she never had. Chillingworth, in some ways, steps in as another father figure for Pearl at the end. Even though at the beginning he would not claim her and said, well, she's no child of mine. Yeah, I'll be nice to her as another human being, but she's no child of mine. She's just yours. Here, he offers her an inheritance as if she were his child. And it gives her a place in the world, and property and wealth which allows her to go off and live her life more. In fact, she moves back to the old world where she seems to marry and be happy, finally coming into her own, and even takes Hester away for a while to live with her. But after some time, Hester does return and puts back on the Scarlet Letter and lives the rest of her life out in this city. But she's definitely a different person, and people definitely see her differently. And she's no longer familyless nor loveless because she seems to continually have connection and correspondence to Pearl and Pearl's family. The book says, "And as Hester Prynne had no selfish ends, nor lived in any measure for her own profit and enjoyment, people brought all their sorrows and perplexities and besought her counsel as one who had herself gone through a mighty trouble. Women, more especially, in the continually recurring trials of wounded, wasted, wronged, misplaced, or erring in sinful passion, or with the dreary burden of a heart unyielded, because unvalued and unsought, came to Hester's cottage, demanding why they were so wretched, and what the remedy. Hester comforted and counseled them as best she might." She becomes a comforter and a counselor to all the people. And ultimately, when she dies, she's buried very close to Dimmesdale. Little space between them, for decorum. But there's one black tombstone with a Scarlet Letter on it. Thanks for looking at this book with me. I hope you've enjoyed our study. It's a richly symbolic, richly romantic, beautiful story, and I hope that you've seen that blossom of beauty throughout it. Thanks for watching. You can click to subscribe, or to watch one of my other series of videos. If you like Romanticism, I highly recommend heading on over to Faust next, and I'll see you later. Bye-bye.